All right, well, I asked about the city or town you grew up in because today Jesus is actually going to make his way back to his hometown where he was from. He's been teaching, he's been traveling around. We've heard him going across and back and forth on a lake and walking around. But today, he'll actually make his return home. And Jesus has kind of done a lot of stuff. His name's starting to spread. And sometimes when people that have become kind of a big deal come back home, there's like this hero's welcome or a big thing, right? Like they came back, maybe put your name on a water tower or something like that. It also could be met with disdain, like they don't represent us, they're not like us, anything, or it could be apathetic, we don't care what you did. But usually, sometimes there's something about kind of that person coming back home. Now, here's what I want us to look at with Jesus, though. We're going to see how it goes with him in his hometown today, but I want us to remember, too, if we think about heaven as actually being Jesus' hometown, and that's where we are going to be citizens of, that Jesus is actually kind of like being part of our hometown. And we want to treat Jesus like our hometown hero is the phrase I will say. We're not from Jesus' physical hometown, but when heaven is our true home, we see Jesus as being from that. So heaven is our hometown, and Jesus is our hometown hero. I want us to kind of think like that. Before we get into what that looks like and means for us, we're going to look at how Jesus' hometown responded to him. We're going to be in Mark, starting chapter 6 today. It'll be verse 1 through the first half of verse 6. That's our whole passage for today. So we'll read that all at the beginning. It's marked on your table. It'll be up here behind me. Follow along, Bibles, tablets, computers, whatever you got. I will be in the NIV translation per usual. So Mark 6, verse 1 through the first half of verse 6, and we will see how Jesus was greeted in his hometown. Let's find out. Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. Where's this wisdom that's been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith, and we will stop there. So Jesus has been in Capernaum. That's been kind of the main site for his ministry, but he has now returned home. This would be Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, as we know the famous story there, but Nazareth was where he grew up, considered his hometown. And he went and taught in the synagogue there. We've seen this before. Jesus goes, kind of does a guest spot teaching in the synagogue. And we've seen before, many people are kind of amazed and in kind of awe, like, what is this teaching? What's going on here? There's authority, there's confidence here. But the amazement in Nazareth was not met with the same graciousness and good awe and wonder as it was other places. There is skepticism. There is questions. There is doubt. Like he would have heard about what he's doing in Capernaum, but there is still doubt and questions about what he's doing. They aren't perceiving who Jesus truly is. They start to ask questions. And they first ask, isn't this the carpenter? So they refer to him by his vocation, his job. Now, a carpenter was a perfectly good profession in this day, but not one that would have inspired a lot of authority or somebody of high status necessarily. There is an ancient Jewish text called the Sirach that kind of gives a contrast to a laborer versus a scribe. And a laborer, which is how the people would have seen Jesus, they were skilled with the work of their own hands. It says that. But they wouldn't have been people sought out for the counsel of others. They weren't important in public assembly. They weren't among the rulers. So they see Jesus as just this laborer, just like them, nothing special. They're like, isn't this the son of Mary? And that seems like no big deal, but in this day and age, because of the way gender roles worked, referring to somebody as the son of the mother was actually a derogatory way to refer to them. You would have referred to them as the son of the father in a positive light, but to do the son of the mother was actually a shot. And they list off the rest of Jesus' family as if to say, we know him, we know his family, there's no way he's special, there can't be anything about him, he can't have this level of authority. In Nazareth, it's a small town. It's one of those everybody knows everybody kind of place. And Jesus says a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and among his relatives. He's likening back to the Old Testament where there are prophets of God that were rejected. He's going back, if we remember, a few chapters in Mark when Jesus' own family tried to pull him away from how he was doing his ministry, thinking he had lost his mind. The people of his hometown had very little faith. It says he only could heal a few people there. He couldn't do miracles. Now, he had the power to do miracles, but the problem is because of their lack of faith, there's this rejection. There's lack of faith. His presence is marginalized and muted. They wouldn't have really understood that it was Jesus doing it. So the lack of faith is at this level that amazed Jesus. He was rejected among his own townspeople. We need to flip that. We want to make Jesus the hometown hero. So I want to look at two ways we can make Jesus a hometown hero and two things we can do with our faith that will make him that hometown hero as well. The first way to look at Jesus is Jesus, the human, the person. He came to earth as fully human. It's how the people of Nazareth knew him, right? His family knew he was a carpenter. Oh, you know, that's little Jesus from down the road, used to play by the river, right? He's just a guy. Nothing inherently wrong with that. He was human. For us, this really matters because Jesus had to be fully human to take on the sins of human. He had to experience human suffering and human sorrow. He had to live a fully human life without succumbing to sin. There's an old phrase, he could not redeem that which he did not become. So he couldn't redeem humanity without becoming human. So on an eternal level, that's the biggest part of why we accept Jesus as fully human. But him being fully human also makes him relatable. Like, look at Jesus. We've been doing this thing at dinner throughout the last week or so, trying to ask different questions, get the kids to talk, and we'll have conversations around the table. And one of them that popped up this week was name a TV show character or a movie character that you relate to. And I popped up with Phil Dunphy from the show Modern Family because I love his famous line, "I'm the cool dad." Of course I want to be the cool dad with my kids. We're not quite to the age where they don't think I'm cool yet, but we'll get there. Phil in the show, he's kind of goofy. He embarrasses his kids a lot, tells dad jokes. But in the end, he's a really nice guy that cares about people and loves his family. So I found Phil very relatable. Jesus being human makes him relatable to us a little bit. Look at some of the experience Jesus had as a human. He was tempted. He went out into the wilderness, was tempted by the devil for 40 days. How he was tempted, how he was enticed would have been things that would have been actually tempting to Jesus, legitimately tempting. He didn't give in, but he was indeed tempted. We will be tempted in a variety of ways. We will all be tempted differently, but there will be ways that will be enticing, ways we'll be tempted to give into. We can take comfort in the fact that Jesus was also tempted. Being tempted doesn't make us weak. Being tempted doesn't mean we did anything wrong. It's about what we do with the temptation. So when we are tempted, we can rely on Jesus' strength because he was tempted as well. Jesus also got angry. One of the most famous stories is Jesus comes into the temple and he flips over tables and yells at people about the fact that they've turned a house of worship into a den of thieves. They had defiled the temple. Jesus got angry, and it makes him relatable. We're going to get angry about different things, and we are shown it's okay to get angry about things. We have to deal with that anger appropriately, but we can allow ourselves to get angry about injustice, hatred of others, anything that goes against who Jesus is and what he stands for, right? Like there can be this view of Christians that we're supposed to be happy and go lucky all the time, but it's just not true. Jesus got angry. Righteous anger. We can feel that too. Jesus got angry. We get angry. Other side, Jesus got sad. John chapter 11, Jesus' friend Lazarus dies. It says Jesus wept and was greatly disturbed. It makes total sense. His friend died. He got sad. We would get sad about that. We can't and shouldn't go around walking around like everything's fine with a smile painted on our faces all the time because it's not realistic. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus felt those same emotions. Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus, and he still got sad. So we have these same feelings that Jesus did. It makes him relatable. So Jesus had to be human to redeem us, but his human nature makes him relatable. Second way to look at Jesus is that he is indeed the Son of God. This is the side of Jesus that the townspeople would not have believed in. They're like, he's just a regular dude. He's not a guy that could teach with authority. No wisdom that could come from God. They didn't believe that, except it was true. Right? Those characteristics separated him and made him uniquely him. Think about superheroes, right? These are the characteristics that separate them from humans. When I was growing up, it was Batman, Superman. I know there were others, but those were the two. And I was a Superman fan. Liked his cape, liked that he could fly, the cool thing he did with his eyes, like all that stuff was awesome. He didn't need gadgets. He didn't need cars. He just had all these cool powers. He could do it. Jesus didn't do anything fancy except have the power of God in him. He was fully divine, as we say. We see him as fully human, but he was fully God, fully divine. To fully bear the punishment for sin, to pay our ransom and get us back to God, he had to be divine. Because only the divine could actually lead a sinless life and be the sacrifice needed. So what does believing this, wrapping our heads around this do for us? It reminds us first that our sin is paid for, right? Our sin's paid for. File that under something as Christians we know in our heads, but we don't let really permeate our lives sometimes, knowing that our sin is paid for. Because what that should do is allow us to live in a freedom. But instead, we tend to live more chained by it. Because we hold our sins, we embrace our sins, we embrace the shame that comes with them and think there's no way they could be paid for. Not that. Start believing we're defined by our sin because we keep holding it. That holds us back from living for God. It ties us to who we were and the mistakes we've made rather than allow us to live freely in who God has transformed us into and who he's calling us to be in spite of the mistakes. Yes, you and I have sinned. Guess what? We're going to sin again. But it's paid for and it's covered. We can embrace and use the freedom we have in Jesus to live for him. Now, it's not a license to go sin just because we feel like it, but it allows us to focus not on what we might do right or wrong, but instead focus just on doing what God has called us to do. And it makes a difference in how we live. People will see that. Let them see that in you because of the power of Jesus. I believe Jesus would rather us live freely for him and maybe make a mistake here and there than be held back by trying to live perfect for him. So live freely, not perfectly, for Jesus. And then it means that heaven is our destination. Jesus, being fully divine, allowed him to defeat the grave and death. By defeating death, he has granted us the promise of eternal life. Eternal community with God, being with God and in his presence forever. Heaven, where the pain, the struggles, and the temptations are no more. Wherever life takes us, whatever this life throws at us here on earth, isn't it? There's more and it's better. And we have that promise from God, and God doesn't break promises. Today, right now, as we sit here together, we have that promise. So whether your life feels full of hope right now, or it feels totally hopeless, or you're somewhere in between, we have hope in the promise of heaven. We wouldn't have that if Jesus wasn't fully divine and that true Son of God. The true Son of God that came to earth as human while also being divine. We need to know both of those and believe both sides of that. So those are two ways we look at Jesus to help him be that hometown hero. But then our faith, we got to look at what our faith does. Two parts to this. The first part is we want to make sure that we don't mute Jesus. So Jesus, when he was in his hometown, he could have gone all out. When they weren't believing in him, he could have healed, he could have miracled, he could have moved mountains. But the fact is, if the people didn't have the faith that he did it by the power of God, what would it matter? That low level of faith mutes Jesus. One of the best buttons on the TV remote is the mute button, right? You can turn it down. I looked at a few different stories of how this came to be. The one that kind of came up is that it was invented in 1956 by Austrian engineer Robert Adler working for the Zenith Radio Corp in Chicago. And it was actually one of 4 buttons on the Space Command 400 remote, which is supposedly one of the very first remotes. That's a picture that I could find of it. One of the very first commercially marketed remotes. It's got an on-off, a channel up, channel down, and the mute button. And the idea from the mute button, apparently, that the story I found came from his boss, because his boss hated commercials and feared that the intrusions would kill TV, and he wanted the commercials silenced. Now note, though, real quick, it silences the commercials. They still happen. They're still there, but they lost their effectiveness because people couldn't hear them. They couldn't perceive what was being sold. That's what the mute button does. So we want to be sure we don't mute Jesus in our own lives. And this happens when we refuse to see Jesus in a situation or give him credit. Now, I'm not asking you to over-spiritualize every situation, right? Like, Jesus gave me that left turn arrow when I needed to make the turn. I'm not saying we have to do that, but do take note of when things happen in your life if you're only looking around and never looking up to God to see if he was there in it. So how does this happen? How do we mute Jesus in our lives? The first way is pride. We just look at ourselves. It's all internal. I had to do it, right? It had to be me. I'm strong. I'm smart. I'm capable. I did it. Pride also says, if I did it this time, I can do it next time, and next time, and again, and again, and again. It mutes the power of Jesus because it makes us think we can do everything and can do everything by ourselves. See, Satan loves this one because he knows we aren't as strong and as powerful as Jesus, but he really loves it when we think we are because we lose our need. We also mute Jesus with our expectation. We mute God. We're locked in on how or what we think God's going to do. Like there's a certain way he's going to work all the time, right? So God's only in the big and miraculous, right? He only works in ways that are crazy and completely unimaginable. When he's working in my life, it's going to be this incredibly crazy way. I'm going to hear a chorus of angels. I'm going to see doves. That's the way it's going to go, right? Or God only cares about the big worldly life-changing events, doesn't care about my day-to-day life in the mundane. That's the extremes, but this view of God exists, and I've heard it. Now, first, God may absolutely work in those ways. He might. But we mute him when we only look for him in those ways. It limits God because God is at work in your life right now. Maybe it seems like nothing externally has changed, but all of a sudden you're like, man, I'm doing a little bit better. I feel a little better. Spiritually, I'm getting a little better. Because God has worked the people or the situations that are in your life right now. Because God does care about the day-to-day. It seems mundane to us. It's not mundane to God. Each day, maybe you're seeing something more to be grateful for, or seeing a way you can serve or love somebody. See those as God being active right now, even if it's not the expectation that you've had of God in the past. So we get past the expectation. Final one is kind of the quid pro quo idea. If my faith says I did this, then I owe Jesus. I got to pay him back, right? Kyle spotted me $20. I got to hit him back with the $20, right? I got to pay him back evenly. It's that idea. But we don't owe Jesus in the sense of making it even with him. Now, we should respond by living for him, but we can't make things even with him. It's really easy to get trapped into thinking we can, or we have to. And if we're like, man, I can't make it even, we find a reason to be like, well, that can't be God, because if that was God, then I got to pay him back, and I can't do it. We don't want to live like that. God doesn't want us to live like that either, because we can't do it. So we don't live like we need to pay him back. We just live in gratefulness that he did what he did for us. He doesn't want us to live like we want to pay him back, but he does want us to recognize and acknowledge him. Because when we recognize him, we acknowledge him, it doesn't mute him, it actually turns him up. Look at stories that do things that maybe turn Jesus up, make Jesus feel loud. Those stories we heard the last few weeks, the woman who just touched Jesus' clothes and was healed, or Jairus who had the faith to come to Jesus to save his daughter's life. Those are the stories that show faith in Jesus, that Jesus did it. He did it because he has an authority and a power that can only come from God. Nobody could have done what he did. That strong faith makes God loud. Think about loud music. Some prefer music loud, some prefer quiet. When I was younger, it was all loud, right? I remember my bedroom with my massive 3-disc changer. Yep, 3-disc changer stereo. You turn that thing up nice and loud. Right, it was cool because it had 3 discs, right? And a tape deck. Yeah, both. Make that thing nice and loud. Now I'm old, so I prefer my music quieter. But then it was loud. I liked it loud. I actually looked up a few things about why some prefer loud music, and there's some schools of thought as to why it's better. They say you might experience the sound as more full. Louder music will actually feel in your body. Sometimes they say the loud music can actually be a temporary escape or to help you zone out. So there's some reasons to listen to your music loud. Strong faith turns God up. Having strong faith makes God loud. Doesn't happen instantly, right? It's not just as easy as turning a knob. We kind of work towards it. But here's what we do. We spend time with God and start to learn how we hear from him, how we experience him. Get close to him to understand what his presence feels like in our lives, and that starts to turn him up. Get used to being in God's presence and experiencing God's presence. It helps your faith grow. Here's a few ways you can try to do it. Remember last week for the worship time, you read a psalm and you kind of took that in. Do that again. Take a short psalm and read it really slowly all the way through. And then read it again slower. And then one more time even slower, and just take in the words, each verse, and see what God is saying through that psalm. See what it is, and then just sit with God. Ask questions about it. Reflect on it. Or put on a worship song and put the lyrics in front of you so you're not just listening to the melody, but you're actually reading the words of the song to see what it says. And then just listen, taking in those words. And then just talk to God about whatever you want. You need to air it out to God, let the grievances fly, do it. You need to laugh it out with God, whatever you need to do, but then just talk to him. Do those things, whether it seems basic or it seems like a lot to you. Either way, just spending time in God's presence like that helps us make our faith stronger. And when that faith is stronger, we make Jesus louder because we perceive him more. We give him credit more, right? We flex that strong faith. We let the faith biceps bust out of the t-shirt when we see God and believe that it is him, and we give him credit. Let that loudness of God come out of you. Even if you're a quiet and soft-spoken person, you can do this. When there's something to pray about it when you're not asked. A silent prayer can be a deafening prayer. When it is done with the belief and the confidence that God will come through, it is loud and it makes God loud. When there's a direction God is leading you to go, go in that direction no matter what the path looks like, no matter what anyone else is saying. Go, even if it scares you. When there's a need to be met or a person to be served, serve because you have faith in the one that came as a servant. Serve in faith that God will bless that person, not bless you, but bless them and care for that person through you. Or when life feels like a tornado, your mind won't stop spinning, it keeps knocking you down, and the pain doesn't seem to stop. Hold to God and what he has given you, his promises, his grace, his love. Reach out to God and grab those because they're there. Hold to the people that God has put around you. That's loud faith because we know that God is there for us in it. And then when God comes through, when you see that miracle, when you see something work out, whether it's big, small, or somewhere in between, go to God in thanks. Give him credit and the glory for it. He doesn't need it, but he deserves it. All of that is strong faith, and it makes God loud. It is not an easy faith, but it's also not a generic faith. It's personal, it's yours, it's strong, and it's loud, and that's what we want. It's what we need. It's what God deserves. And when we have it, God keeps getting louder and louder and louder. It becomes easier for us to see him. It gives us more opportunities to show others who he is and what he's done, for others to hear him. So we turn God up. Make Jesus the hero, that hometown hero. We'll wrap up with this. Remember, we do it by remembering that Jesus was human. It makes him relatable. He got mad. He got sad. He was tempted. All things that we will feel and experience. Jesus, they happened to him too. He's also the Son of God. We remember that. He had to be divine to take care of our sin. He did that willingly, and it ensures that heaven is indeed our home. So we see Jesus in those ways. And then we remember we don't want our faith to mute him. We want to see and hear Jesus. Don't find another reason or explanation. What Jesus does is powerful, and it's given it power when we believe and perceive that it is indeed him. Don't mute that. Turn Jesus up. Make him loud. Get used to just being with him and hearing him. Grow your faith in him, and it makes it easier to turn him up. Spend time with him about anything, then let faith dictate how you live and let that turn Jesus up. It'll make a difference in your life, and others will start to see it. So let's make Jesus our hometown hero. Remember, heaven's our home. Jesus is in heaven. He's our hometown hero. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this morning. Yeah, I thank you that we can learn from this story, God, that even as Jesus was rejected in his hometown in Nazareth, that they didn't perceive or understand who he was, God. I pray that we would take that as a lesson to always remember who he is and who he is in our lives. God, that we would look at him as fully human, that he came to earth. He came down from heaven to save us. But that while being here, he was still fully God. Pray that we would remember him in those ways. And then, God, I pray that our faith would be strong, that we wouldn't mute the power of you, that we wouldn't limit the effectiveness of you, God, but we would look to you and see you. God, that we would show others you by our faith. I pray that we would make that loud, make that visible, make it something people see and know in our own lives. So, God, I pray that we would, this week, each of us, make sure we're spending time with you, to just get used to being in your presence, to grow that faith, God, and then let it live out through our lives this week, God. Thank you again for this morning. In your name, amen.